exhibition, practice, and such. So we should get a very interesting kind of range of perspectives about the kind of difficulties and potentials of communicating various aspects of basic infrastructure that we live with. I mean, in a sense, this is all focused towards waste, but I really see this as a kind of template to raising questions for other forms of infrastructure, such as, say, electricity or water and such. So I guess what I'd like to do is now introduce the first salon. So we have joining us Geiger from the Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning, and Adrian Blackwell from the Daniel School of Architecture at University of Toronto, and he was also teaching at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard this semester, right? Yeah. So we'll begin with Adrian and Jordan. Our respondent or moderator today will be Dennis Maher, also from the Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning, who I think, as many know, engages with objects on a daily basis in the context of his own very interesting ways. So I'm very excited about the discussion that we'll have.
And in the context of the studio.
And in the context of the studio, absolutely. Work is life. Work is life. Excellent. So, and the other thing I'd like to mention about the salon this morning is that I've asked, because the topic is objects, I've asked all of the speakers this morning to bring or show 2 or 3 objects that they find to be engaged with the kind of domain of everyday experience in interesting ways. So it could be from their work, it could be through their kind of analytical work, their design work, maybe even their scholarly work. So I think it should be, I'm very curious actually.
So first of all, I want to thank Kurt Gambetta for putting together this whole event and for including me in it, and all these really great people. I'm really excited to see what everyone has brought and have some conversation about travel. So as an eye opener, I'm gonna start with some material that might be a little eye opening for the morning, but I guess what I'm hoping is that even though, despite this kind of format, that by virtue of the fact that this is not going to be a very formal presentation, but a set of ideas in the form of some things that are going to have an evanescent quality. They're just going to be flashing before our eyes and have a material presence, and then they'll be gone. But maybe that can flow into how we think about the relation between information and waste materials. So I wanted to start with this word make. Make is something that I thought is an interesting word because I had given it some thought, I guess about 6 years ago or 5 years ago. I started a curatorial project around this that never got completed, but it was identifying ways that for any of us who have kids or have been kids know that make can refer to 2 things. When a child says, "I gotta make," then they're talking about having to go potty. And so there's something about this relationship between waste as production and consumption that I think is worth talking about also in an infrastructural and architectural context, believe it or not. So I wanted to start with this quote. Warhol, in his book, his great book, The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, said, "How can you be running out of anything when there's always the same amount of matter in the universe? I think about people eating and going to the bathroom all the time, and I wonder why they don't have a tube up their behind that takes all the stuff they eat and recycles it back into their mouth, regenerating it, and then they'd never have to think about buying food or eating it. They wouldn't even have to see it. It wouldn't even be dirty." This thing doesn't show me the presenter's notes though, so I'll have to just kind of riff on this. So this is a long part. So with this, as I see it, this is sort of our patron saint of consumerist art. And with one turn of phrase, he's handily turning consumption into production. And so that's no great surprise for him, although he doesn't usually usually talk about it in this context. I feel like it's production as consumption, and it is food and waste management as architecture, as art, as philosophy, as garment design, as so the erasure of all sorts of boundaries happens in this little passage. And I find that really provocative in an era where one of the last regions of kind of single-use architecture is the toilet. The toilet is something where after the free plan and after trans programming and all these different kinds of thought processes remains quite single in its dedication of program and space. But there are some things that I think get overlooked about how we might be still harvesting some goods in the waste, how there's some value in what doesn't have value, what you think of as dirty. So I'm not the first to suggest this. Piero Manzoni, back in the early 60s, canned his own goop. This is Cagata d'Artista, or Maher d'Artista, the artist's shit. So this is kind of an infamous work of art to many. And more recently in Northern California, this is around 10 years ago, Keith Beaudry did these paintings by putting colored fluid in his butt. He also did things where he drank certain liquids that would color his urine, and then he tried to write with his penis. And this itself has, I think, a Warholian kind of context. Without trying to go into an art historical lecture, I think that these are objects that start to riff on some of these ideas in that passage where make has this kind of double meaning. So this is the oxidation painting series from Warhol, which itself is kind of a comment, a kind of making fun of abstract expressionist painting, the kind of drip paintings of Pollock, and turning something that's horizontal, vertical, and so on. Other more recent artworks that start to get more architectural in this context, for me, are some of the interesting ones. This is an installation by the Swiss artist Piccolotti Rist, where you have a kind of auto-surveillance of your use of a toilet. This has been installed in many locations. And I'm sorry I don't have better images of this, but this is, I think, a really exquisitely beautiful early project by Bruce Tom and John Randolph when they worked together under the name Interim Office of Architecture. This is at the Marin Headland Center for the Arts, which is a really fantastic arts community and residency in a converted military barracks and nestled in a converted military landscape. So there's a kind of reclamation of land that's in the very history of this place, and this is the latrines, where they took the kind of brutality and the exposure of the body and the single-sex nature of the bathrooms there, and they started to treat it with these curved, very heavy plates of steel and very carefully created fittings that really reframe the experience of toileting. And I think of these and a few others. There are works of actually Philippe Starck and Dillo Scofidio, early works, and a really wonderful one by Yolanda Daniels of Studio Sumo called The Femme Pissoir. These are really rare cases where architects have started to work on the experience of toileting and sometimes start to, I think, find value in waste. I kind of dabbled in this myself. I did this project some years ago that was about very, very, very large-scale composting toilets that would take over entire regions of cities. That's a polemic. And then one of my favorites, this is the last part of this, is this project by Francois Roche that's called the Mipi Bar. This was a commission for MIT's School of Architecture, where an exterior wall of this neoclassical building was to be fitted within the cavity of the wall with systems that would filtrate visitors' urine and treat it through particle filtration, ozone filtration, and so on, and then add delicious flavors and yield a tea. So it's sort of a tea bar, but let's say it's a do-it-yourself, make-it-yourself kind of a T-bar. So Roche talks about it very interestingly as realigning relationships between the body's waste and architecture. And I want to suggest with this and the following examples that this has much larger consequences when we start to look at the relationship to technology and to information. It's not just about like making icky stuff, not icky or something like that. So what if we start to look at making ourselves? There's a great history. This is kind of classic German toilets. This is, maybe it's in other countries, but I think of it as especially German, that there's this handy shelf for the visual inspection of your own output. And that's really about a kind of analysis, a visual analysis for understanding your body's health. And more recently, Todo Corporation of Japan has created this thing called, I think it's called something like the Intelligentsia toilet. It can't be that. That would be a great name. In any case, it does real-time urinalysis and fecal analysis, and it's attached to these gizmos that can check your pulse and so on. It can wirelessly send it to your mobile phone. So all this kind of information analysis is something that can also start to become networked. There's this kind of true gathering of, kind of consumerist data. We have a growing fascination about our bodies as we wear a heart monitor and halter while we jog, but why not, very reasonably check our digestive tract also. On the other hand, there's an aggregation of data, mining of data from our bodies that also gets collected into all sorts of social media. So I want to see what kind of consequences this has when it starts to get big, when it starts to become part of very large systems that take the kind of byproduct or the kind of leftovers, as Warhol called it, sometimes call it leftovers. He sort of cast himself as a recycler, and see like what kind of value is found in the value list in these architectural and human-computer interaction scenarios. So one is in my trash, so me and my trash. And this is part of a piece of research that the graduate student Alex Marchuk did in the Situated Technologies Research Group last year. And this was looking at the waste collection systems, the infrastructure in the new city of Songdo, outside of Seoul in Korea. And Songdo is many things, including an incipient host for the very first SUNY outside of the United States. But it's also, very interestingly, it's 70% privately owned. It's established by 3 major corporations, one of which is Cisco. And so Cisco systems absolutely suffuse everything in the physical infrastructure of the city. And it's part of the way that the city steeps itself in a kind of picture of its 21st century-ness. So it has a pneumatic waste collection system. Itself is sophisticated, but not altogether unprecedented. But what becomes interesting is where the waste infrastructure and the information infrastructure mix. So this is a diagram not by Alex, but found by Alex, that shows this. Under USN, you see RFID, Zigbee, Bluetooth, Y-beam, and UWB. These are methods of data collection, and is cross-referenced with U environment directly beneath it. So this is what you're seeing in this diagram of Alex's is how input stations come in various types, many of which are street side, but some of which are in private residences. And so what they're promising is that within your private residence, you can toss your waste into a chute, and it not only immediately sorts what's recyclable from what's not recyclable, from what's compostable, and so on, and very efficiently transports it through a pneumatic system, but it can also scan it for what waste you're sending out. And so it promises that if you send out something that is has a deposit on it, then it can even insert that 5 cents in your bank account. So by the same reason, it can also harvest information. It doesn't just plant it. It can harvest all kinds of data about people's consumption, like concern, you're drinking a lot lately, this kind of thing. So, then there's my commute. So this is from a little research project that I've done from time to time, where I've looked at ways that toll plazas have been changing over the last years. Toll plazas themselves a 20th century kind of architectural and landscape object, but of course now they're cross-referencing police tracking data with automotive registration data, with bank data, and so on, in order to have an RFID or Easy Pass crossing at international borders that's facilitated more and more by Nexus. And it starts to reveal how the toll plaza becomes obsolete, it's unstaffed, and it starts to become unnecessary. So all of these grand swaths of leftover land where the road needs to widen in order to accommodate that slowdown in traffic, these are now ripe for rethinking, because these can become areas for the remediation of things like both air quality remediation, but also thinking about the cultural transformation that a commuter goes through as they cross a border from being a kind of bridge and tunnel person to a city person for the day. So this is kind of a quick survey that we started at the US-Canadian road crossings, and we started to mark out red and blue on all the different water and land crossings, and then we started to calculate what these add up to. They really, if you start thinking about these as wasted pieces of land that can start to be reclaimed, and that are across a kind of hybrid of physical architecture, a built environment, and also informational. These are places of a data interaction, that these can be new forms of park space or public space. And they really quite add up a lot. They add up to larger than any park in the North American continent. They add up to much larger than many small towns. But they're distributed across the whole border, of course. And you can also cross-reference them by the size, the physical size, to the amount of tonnage of carbon dioxide that's emitted at each, because when you have idling engines, then you see this kind of relationship between land area and that kind of waste, and cultural identity as people cross by the volume, the number of people crossing. So there's this kind of odd mixture of cultural and ecological and architectural and other kinds of transformations. And then just by a quick glance, you can see this dramatic change where all these little green circles up at the top, that's our extremely porous and very informal boundaries between the US and Canada. And by contrast to Mexico, you see very few, very, very gigantic circles. These represent the amount of border crossings at each. So you see the way that we try to really channel, funnel, control the locations and the numbers of crossings. So that's an indicator also of how we think of our borders culturally. And I think this is the last of the examples where, again, I'm trying to look at ways or suggest ways that we can talk about harvesting information and maybe controlling it a little bit more between the waste that where make is both production and consumption again. So Mind Crops is looking at what's called precision agriculture, and this is again an ongoing research project. This I started with an architect in California named Virginia Sanfratello about 4 years ago. And this is an example of an image called a false color image. This was produced by NASA, by satellite, so it uses remote sensing to take a non-visual image of a field. This is a crop field, and to analyze it for vegetation density, water deficit, and nitrogen content. And you see that these are not all the same image. Like if you look at number 117, that little square in the middle on the right-hand side, it looks very different in the bottom from the middle image. So it might be okay in terms of water, but not in terms of nitrogen. And this kind of system gets used very, very widely now to drive drone tractors in order to to optimize the planting of crops, but also to minimize the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So there seems to be something nice about it. It enables GPS to be a way of both reading the landscape and also writing the landscape. So we look at satellites as operating in a kind of read-write mode in that sense. But so far, it's been a really dumb result. It's just monoculture. It's corn, corn, corn for many hundreds of thousands of acres. And so we looked at this and tried to ask questions about how it not only could be used to start producing permaculture, or polyculture at least, but how people in different size communities can have a role in reading and writing landscape through this. So this is an example of the kind of the GPS controlled tractors, not only making absolutely millimeter perfect rows, but then avoiding a house in the middle to produce a very strange image. This is a much more common one if you look for it. When you start to see how things get controlled in order to be viewed from above, then you have this great logocentrism that lands, right? So you know that things don't get analyzed so much informatically as visually, even if they're not made that way. It might be a numeric calculation that leads to this, but it's meant to be seen as Wells Fargo or we remember 9/11. So that's kind of a caution for us about how, once you start to control the way things are looking from above, then they could very easily be a Coca-Cola logo. This is a diagram of how we tried to rethink this, that you have tractor down at the ground, you have a computer interface in between a satellite and that tractor that's reading and also writing the landscape. But to the left, we add this kind of, this new thing, which is, at the moment, suggesting a challenge to the USDA. And so we're actually pursuing a large grant with the USDA in order to implement this. We're suggesting that with a very mild modification of the hopper, not even of any information technology, that the seed hopper can be controlled to have 4 different seeds or 5 different seed types instead of just one, and that a kind of drawing in the ground can start to deposit seeds differently and to produce a planned polyculture. But this interface on the left would actually be a challenge to modify, therefore, the website of the USDA. And that would be because the U.S. Department of Agriculture is responsible not only for farming practices, but also for nutrition norms. But in our opinion, it fails to cross-reference these things. So we know that if the average carrot travels 1,500 miles to get to your plate, we know that that is at lots of expense. We know that it costs us nutritionally and so on. But the USDA does not represent the relationship between the farming practice and the nutrition. And we're suggesting that it could, so that this kind of Google browser view would start to actually appear within. So we actually, this is just some screenshots from it, but in our first sketches, we actually put it into the Google browser. So there's a whole fly-through that shows, this is a longer story, but this is a trip to the very county where the journalist Michael Pollan traveled in Iowa to write part of his book, The Omnivore's Dilemma. And we looked at this part of the Jeffersonian grid and imagined it as replanted with a polyculture that actually took on this problem of the image and how that becomes information. So that the image is something that's, in this case, in the first test, this kind of logocentric thing, deliberately a kind of chimera of different crops that are growing there. But that, as you zoom in, it starts to just appear as lines. And that then it would also be a kind of searchable landscape. So the same way that we would have a Google Street View, you would have a Google Crop View. So you could learn about the actual crops. And for a kid who grows up in the city, as I did, and had absolutely no clue, you could see what corn looks like down in the ground, that kind of thing. Learn about this particular farm's practice of growing it, where the seeds come from, whatever. But further, it would be a way, as we see it, that the Jeffersonian grid, which we started this project trying to think at the service of big agriculture, the same big agriculture that really most commands precision farming. We started to see that actually this has a greatest potential to benefit CSAs. And so we're hoping if we're successful with a grant with the USDA to actually run tests with a CSA or community-supported agriculture in Western New York and also in Northern California as tests. And the reason is that CSAs have a very particular relationship in space and economic model that I think, or we think, is tied to the grid. So each of these grids, 640 acres, set up many, many years ago. But in this particular county, down here around the letter G in Google, the lowercase g, is a town ironically called Jefferson, but it can't eat anything that's being farmed around it because it's all non-food grain corn food grade. But with a system such as this, it could be that there are different ways that the corn could be grown to, I'm sorry, not corn, but the variety of crops could be within certain parameters that are subject to what's appropriate in that land, what makes good companion crops, what actually works with a minimum of monoculture. And then within those choices, members of that community could actually go onto an interface and choose and say, well, you know, I'm not so into it, bro, but I would love some, I don't know, winter rye. So that's the kind of messianic promise of our project. And this is an early sketch, this kind of very image-based, not because we liked it, but because we thought we had to start by admitting it. But these are more recent sketches, and we need to do many more. And these are sketches that assume changing patterns that respond to local conditions according to things like water deficit or vegetation density, soil sedimentation, or nitrogen content. And so these are examples of how those patterns could respond. The image above is in Iowa, and the one below is in a farmland in Marin County, California. Oh, and then I'm sorry, I lied. There is just one last coda. This is the very last thing. But I just wanted to conclude with the notion that we ourselves are also subject to being both waste and byproduct, salvageable for our value after we've been kind of left wasted, left useless. And here I'm talking about a current project that's getting developed, and I hope to launch in about 2 or 3 weeks. And this is a project right here in Buffalo that is at this, kind of at the service of, I don't know, it's discussing with or working with immigration and refugee communities in Buffalo's West Side. So in this, I've been working with the Grand Street Neighborhood Center, and for those of you who know the West Side, you know that it is a really, really culturally and ethnically diverse community, and it's been much more so in the last few years because of the huge influx of immigrants largely from Somalia and Sudan and Burma, but also Mexico, and before it, other waves from Puerto Rico and from Italy in decades past. So you have this very small community that has been marked by generations of immigration and of refugee influx, and a lot of this has to do with policy that is global refugee policies. So the children who go to this neighborhood center speak a lot of languages. They speak Mai and Spanish, they speak Burmese, And so this is a kind of oral history recording pavilion of sorts, where the children who go there will have an opportunity to go in and record a little bit of their personal history, but the first things that they'll record are basic facts of where they came from and what year. And so this is kind of how this pavilion thing looks, which is irrelevant in a way. It could look like anything. It's mostly looking this way just because it's very quickly deployable and because it provides a modicum of privacy. But it will trace paths of these answers to a global map that shows the origin of a person's, the participants' kind of objective data to Buffalo and tag it. That's kind of the key, is that it will tag it with the immigration policy that likely attended their migration here. So there's a way that an individual can see their contribution to this very global process and also understand what they might not have, which is how larger information systems, I would call it, these kind of political policies affect their move. And so the project is called Beaufleuve. It's kind of a play on this one of the creation myths of the city's name, this kind of misunderstanding of what the French supposedly said when they got here. So I think that's it.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I think the first part of this project is going to fit very nicely into Jordan's discourse, and I think also this will be nicely complementary because I think it's a little bit more anachronistic than Jordan's, but also dealing with questions of infrastructure. I'm going to break all the rules of the Salon by reading my text. Okay, so obsolete objects, interventions into the space-time of neoliberal infrastructure. Objects become obsolete in three distinct ways: usefully, economically, and ideologically. Private objects tend to fall into one of the first two categories. They reach obsolescence through the rule of the commodity, either through their use value or their exchange value. Public infrastructures, on the other hand, are more easily affected by purely ideological obsolescence because they're governed more directly by the political state. The shift from Keynesian ideology of the post-war period to the contemporary ideology of globalized neoliberalism has involved a repudiation of public infrastructures to court and an attempt to privatize them on many fronts, from telephones to highways to energy provision. In their 2001 book, Splintering Urbanism, Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin argue that there's been a decisive shift away from the provision of massive and universal infrastructures under Fordism to a highly differentiated and unequal provision of infrastructure under post-Fordism. They call this new urbanism unbundled or splintered as a way of describing this differentiation, but they also see these forms of infrastructure as having a splintering effect on urban spaces. If Fordist infrastructures cut the city into large pieces so that someone might use the expression the other side of the tracks to describe a neighborhood of a different race or class, post-Fordist cities simply provide different qualities of infrastructure for different citizens based on their ability to pay for them. This talk will examine three artworks that I've made, which each examine a different obsolete infrastructure. These three projects each engage in infrastructure which provides a basic right to the city, the right to relieve oneself in private, the right to eat and buy essential commodities, and the right to affordable housing. Public washrooms. The first of these infrastructures is the public washroom. Above is a slide showing an entrance to a public washroom that was built beneath the street in Toronto at the intersection of Queen and Spadina Streets. This washroom was removed long ago, and the disappearance of public washrooms from urban spaces can be seen as parallel to the recent gentrification of downtown urban spaces in North America. So I'm going to show a project that occupies the same intersection in Toronto. Public water closet, which was made in 1998 in Toronto. Public Water Closet is an attempt to place art not simply in a public context, but also within a social and political dialogue. The project makes available one of the basic infrastructures of public space, a washroom. Its aesthetic and conceptual strategy acts in part as an alibi for the controversial proposition that public space should be open for use by any member of the public, regardless of their economic situation, and not merely as a publicly funded location for capitalist accumulation. The form of the work diverts, or in situationist terminology, detourns, the basic function of the two-way mirror, which is to provide systems of power and invisibility from which to survey a population to be controlled. In Public Water Closet, the hierarchy is reversed, so that people on the street who are currently being harassed and prosecuted for their expression of basic needs and functions are allowed a location from which to watch the city without being seen. The project initiates an alternate relation between individuals and municipal infrastructure, which is currently being designed and constructed as one element of a paranoid fantasy of coercion. Public Water Closet is a minimum architecture whose rationale and effects operate beyond mere functionalism. It specifically addresses desire and play in the city within the device. Users appear barely protected by a thin sheet of glass from viewers on the street, creating a dialectic of voyeurism and exhibitionism. The work is clearly influenced by the related practices of Robert Smithson, who postulated sculpture as a mirroring at sight, or Matt Clark, who literally cut buildings open, exposing their interiors to view, and Dan Graham, whose use of reflective glass in the construction of fun houses and follies disarms one of contemporary architecture's most ubiquitous and problematic materials. Public Water Closet is a prototype. It plays with the modernist ambition of universality. Theoretically, it can go anywhere, but it works best in a city where washrooms are not available and where their emergency provision would be useful. It was conceived in the context of Mike Harris's Ontario and Mel Lastman's Toronto. Both politicians prioritized tactics of police repression over economic redistribution or provision of basic public infrastructures. In the summer of 1998, the province shoved the Safe Streets Act down people's throats. This new law gave the police special powers to criminalize behaviors characteristic of homeless people, including aggressive panhandling and squeegeeing, the only means that many individuals had to survive. The city voted to increase police funding to pay officers overtime to remove unwanted persons from the city's parks and other public spaces. These two tactics facilitate the Urban Design Department's program of reurbanization. This agency is interested in increasing housing densities downtown, ostensibly as a means of reducing sprawl at the periphery. But all new development of in the downtown consists of condominiums for individuals or couples, and is affordable primarily by affluent professionals. The city is more interested in raising property values than maintaining the current diversity of Toronto's downtown population. New policing policies are directly linked to strategies of gentrification through which the city itself acts as a commodity for global capital. Public Water Closet is materialized as architecture to suggest an alternate approach to Toronto's urban design. In Toronto, it was located at the corner of Queen and Spadina, the epicenter of the conflict surrounding squeegeeing, where local businesses and cafes demanded protection from these independent entrepreneurs. To install the water closet legally, I needed the permission of surrounding stores. Many were amenable to the project because it was an artwork, as long as the washroom was not placed directly in front of their store. However, certain businesses were vehemently opposed, claiming they would take the issue to their councillor, arguing that it would encourage people they considered undesirable to inhabit city streets. These responses transparently articulated an understanding shared by the city and the province as to who is considered a legitimate inhabitant of public space. Public Water Closet attacks what Samir Amin has called the single thought of contemporary capitalism, globalized neoliberalism. The project proposes, first of all, that alternate frameworks for urbanism must be investigated. This is to say that at no moment can we accept the reduction of urbanism to its own capitalist single thought. Second, it specifically argues the city cannot be segregated along class lines as the commodification of urban space currently insists. Rather, it has to operate as an engine of difference and adjacency. Third, it attempts to invent an architecture of play. Public infrastructure could allow for sensuality and erotics, invented autonomously through participation and collaboration, rather than through media's constantly increasing infiltration of our city streets. Finally, it creates an architecture that subverts the growing militarization of urban space, that is the corollary of current attempts to liberalize trade and investment under the stewardship of global capital. Okay, the tricycle market combines two obsolete infrastructures: the disappearance of informal markets and the small-scale retail from gentrifying urban spaces, and the disappearance of economical and ecological transportation infrastructures like the bicycle. So this is actually a project in Sichuan, China, and Chengdu for the last Chengdu biennial in the fall of 2011. I'm going to start with this quote from Fernand Braudel. A third sector should be added to the pre-industrial model, that lowest stratum of the non-economy, the soil into which capitalism thrusts its roots, but which it can never really penetrate. This lowest layer remains an enormous one. Above it comes the favored terrain of the market economy, with its many horizontal communications between different markets. Here, a degree of automatic coordination usually links supply, demand, and prices. Then alongside, or rather above this layer, comes the zone of the anti-market, where the great predators roam and the law of the jungle operates. This, today as in the past, before and after the Industrial Revolution, is the real home of capitalism. The cargo tricycle is a Chinese migrant worker's tool, a means to make a living by moving, collecting, or selling things. For many, it is the fundamental means of production, providing its owner a foothold in the market economy and a small measure of autonomy from work in factories, construction, or service industries controlled by large capitalist enterprises. Tricycle market was designed for the Chengdu Biennial, which took place in the city's East Music Park in a recently gentrified industrial area. This artwork gave vendors a chance to sell their wares inside the biennial grounds, where this practice was prohibited and access was controlled. In the process, the market provided basic services for biennial visitors. Structurally, it consisted of a modular system based on groups of 3 tricycles, acting as a ballast to hold down the corners of standard construction tarps, cut and sewn into triangles. Together, the tarps and tricycles formed a minimal architecture protecting vendors and users of the market from the sun and rain. The architecture's aggregation necessitated the collective organization of vendors within the market, as each was responsible for a tarp and a frame to connect their cart to the tarp, and a center post, so the tarp could only be set up when at least 3 vendors were present. Okay, 3 markets: the non-economy, the market economy, and the anti-market. The French historian Fernand Braudel understood capitalism as a tripartite structure consisting of the non-economy, the market economy, and the anti-market. While it was clear to Braudel that it was the anti-market, the financial and governmental sector, which ruled the economy under capitalism in general, today this has become even clearer after the most recent financial crisis of globalized neoliberalism. In China's reform economy, peasants have been mostly relegated to the non-economy, forming a vast labor reserve, out of which they're called to work temporarily within cities. Sichuan exports more labor than any other Chinese province because it is one of the country's lowest minimum wages. If the rural periphery remains a non-market, urban space, by contrast, is tightly disciplined by the liquidity of the anti-market. Today's precarious labor is caught between the risk of falling into the vast rural non-economy and the punishing power of finance capital. The result of this double bind is the incredibly low wages paid to the mobile labor responsible for making the commodities consumed around the world and for creating surplus value that propels China's economy forward. The market for tricycles. The onset of neoliberalism, with its emphasis on individualism and denigration of the social, caused a slowdown in global bicycle production, which leveled off from the late 1980s until the early years of the new millennium. As a result of China's massive market share, much of this global slowdown was attributable to changes in its domestic market, where bicycle commuting has declined significantly in recent years, as it's been replaced by cars, seen as markers of class distinction. The process has constituted a stark reversal of the mid-century situation, when the Chinese Communist government promoted the bicycle as a universal and classless solution to the problem of transportation. Despite this domestic decline, China has risen to become the world's leading exporter of bicycles and cargo tricycles, now holding 2/3 of the combined global market share and undermining bicycle production in other parts of the world. Since 2003, there's been a marked increase in global bicycle manufacturing in response to aggressive programs promoting cycling as a sustainable mode of transportation in Europe and the Americas. In this moment, China is still in a good place to take advantage of bicycles as a mode of transportation. But in order to do this, it will have to change government and economic policies to reverse the recent move towards private car ownership. The Chengdu tricycle market. In the face of these global realities, tricycle market was designed to do three things. First, it was meant to exhibit the sustainable low technology of China's cargo tricycles for both international and local audiences, transforming this everyday reality in China into an example for the world, and to remind local politicians and planners of the enormous potential inherent in this already existing and quotidian technology for improving urban space. Second, it was conceived of as a means to place migrant service workers at the center of the biennial, inverting their general condition of invisibility to make them visible in this international exhibition, in the process altering the specific distribution of the sensible that the biennial's political logic proposed. Finally, the tricycle market presented architectural form as a mediation of independence and connectivity without hierarchy. The project functioned as an anarchist architecture in the sense that its very structure and form required horizontal and non-hierarchical organization of participants who remade the structure on a daily basis. Okay. The anti-market at work. Capitalism only triumphs when it becomes identified with the state, when it is the state. Despite its clear intentions, the tricycle market encountered significant forms of resistance when it was actually deployed at the biennial. First, it was originally proposed as an agglomeration of food vendors, because the streets of Chengdu are filled with tricycles selling Sichuan cold noodles, breakfast porridge and pancakes, sugarcane drinks, and many other local snacks. And a food market would have guaranteed both its popularity and the economic self-sufficiency of the workers. However, the organizational committee of the music park permitted the sale of food from vendors in the park for economic and health reasons. So the project was forced to proceed selling other wares. Wallets, books, soft drinks, fruit, and undergarments, which were less likely to be desirable to visitors or profitable for the vendors. Second, a few days before the opening, the biennial committee and the municipal authorities decided that a tricycle market could not be installed for the biennial's opening, when the officials would be visiting and media would be present. Although the exact cause of the decision was never stated, it was clear that the sight of rural migrants selling cheap and everyday wares in the biennial was considered unseemly and an unacceptable backdrop for this official event. These resistances both point to the intertwined relationships between market demands and state control. These interrelationships are, as Brodel suggests, fundamental to capitalism in general, but they're especially evident in China today, where a strong authoritarian government supports the free play of the market. This reaction illustrates the subversive force tricycle market as an idea within the biennial. Its aim was to create a mobile architecture that intervenes within the field of Chinese capitalism at each of the three layers defined by Brodel, confronting the decentralized precarity of the contemporary economy with a weapon of autonomy and solidarity. Okay, the third public infrastructure that's obsolete that I wanted to discuss was public housing. Public housing no longer makes sense to anyone. So this is a project that I did with Jane Hutton, who teaches landscape architecture at the GSD at Harvard. And it's called Calculus of Forms, Building and Erasing Utopias. Calculus of Forms examines the relationships between the quantitative and qualitative dimensions of urban form. Cities have certain shapes which hold us in particular ways and allow us to move along specific paths. They're historical, changing over time according to political and economic vicissitudes. The exhibition presents a set of stacked models that illustrate the changing urban form of 7 public housing sites on the Great Lakes: Regent Park, Alexander Park, and Lawrence Heights in Toronto, Jeffries Homes in Detroit, and Robert Taylor Homes, Cabrini Green, and Henry Horner Homes in Chicago. Each site is housed on a different shelving unit with 3 shelves. The lowest shows the site before public housing was built. The middle shelf illustrates the completed public housing project, and the highest presents either the proposed or present state of its redevelopment. The work has 2 axes: a horizontal axis which organizes space and locates the housing in the region, the city, and within the public housing neighborhood, and a vertical axis which measures time, rising from the floor at 1880 in 1 centimeter increments each year. This temporal axis illustrates the close relationship between urban form and the political and economic regimes that guide the construction of these successive utopian projects. After the Second World War, North American governments produced plans to revitalize decaying downtowns through urban renewal. As part of this initiative, cities built public housing for people living in what were named blighted neighborhoods. Through this policy, thousands of units of housing for low-income residents were built in large cities across the continent, improving living conditions for many, but at the same time erasing older areas and destroying the social support networks that proliferated in them. Over the 50 years after these public housing projects were built, they fell into disrepair as government stopped maintaining them. In 1992, the United States federal government initiated Hope 6, Housing Opportunities for People Everywhere, to fund the demolition and reconstruction of the most dilapidated housing projects. The legislation mandated that modernist housing was to be erased and replaced with low-rise, mixed-income communities designed in neo-traditional style according to the architectural principles of the new urbanism. As a result, it was impossible to replace the number of previously subsidized units, so that federal grants were allocated to fund a substantial reduction in the actual number of subsidized housing units. Canada followed these U.S. policies approximately a decade later. While Canada's redevelopment projects have diverged from their U.S. precedents, in that they tend to strive for full replacement of subsidized units, and as a result are built to much higher densities than the original public housing, they're similar in that they also attempt to re-engineer a mix of subsidized and market units at ratios of approximately 1/4 to 1/3 public units. This has meant that large tracts of publicly owned land are being privatized, and the neighborhoods surrounding public housing are being gentrified, decreasing the amount of affordable housing in the area. These 7 sets of models trace the physical demolition of modernist public housing neighborhoods that has followed from the ideological repudiation of public housing, beginning in the 1970s and reaching full force in the early 1990s. The hard push towards home ownership as a solution to housing problems, to the housing challenges of low-income people, has been the most recent point in this trajectory, and its repercussions were felt in the subprime mortgage crisis of 2007 and its derivative effects in 2008's financial crisis. The people most affected by each of these historical moments, from the devastation of urban renewal when public housing was first built, to the long period of neglect of public housing, to the displacement caused by contemporary redevelopment plans and the foreclosures of the subprime crisis, have been the city's lowest income residents. So I'm just going to briefly describe the actual installation. This is, on the left, it's pretty hard to read in this projection, but there's a graph that we lifted from Gerard Dumenil and Dominique Levy's essay in the New Left Review called Neoliberal Income Trends, Wealth, Class, and Ownership in the USA. And it simply talks about, there are 3 lines here. There's the top 1% of the population, the top 10% of the population, and the bottom 90%. And it's equalized for 1950 in the graph. So, and it goes from 1900 roughly on the floor and moves upwards. And so in 1950 everything's equalized, but you can see that the bottom 90% of the population have a lot smaller, they have a reduced, a negative share of overall income at the beginning part of the century, and they have a greatly decreased share of overall income. Starting in about 1970, there's a great decline. There's a period in the middle where the income share of the bottom 90% doesn't change that much. And so we actually aligned this graph vertically on the wall next to these drawings of the 3 periods of public housing that we're looking at, in order just to show that there are different economic moments and that they have different ideologies of public housing associated with them. So this is just the plan and section of the gallery. It's a bit hard to read again, but as you can see, we drew on the floor, actually, it's too light in this plan, but there's actually a map of the Great Lakes first, locating the 3 cities, and then there are the 3 cities, locating the public housing projects within the cities, and then there are the plans. The darkest things are actually the models, the location of the models on the floor. And up top, you see all the elevations of the 3 periods of the 7 models on the wall with statistics. So this is the whole gallery. This is an example of one. This is Lawrence Heights in Toronto, which was a greenfield site. So you just see some farm buildings before public housing, and then a large public housing layer. And then it's very hard to read in this case, but Lawrence Heights is actually very dense. It's built to 8 times the public housing density. So it can have, only 1/8 of the final population will be right here to income units, and the rest of it will be market housing. And then this is a kind of zoom in on Alexander Park in downtown Toronto. This is before public housing. This was built in the 1970s, and so it's not a tower neighborhood. It's actually a much more based on Italian hill towns. It's kind of a much lower density and circuitous laneway public housing project. And it's going to be radically densified as well to something like 3 or 4 times its existing density. But then to compare this to an American example, this is Robert Taylor Homes. This is the situation before. And of course, the highway is built in the same piece of land. So you get the destruction of existing fabric through the highway, and then directly adjacent to it, you have these 22 towers. I think it's about 2.5 miles of towers that line the highway, just south of IIT. And provided many units of housing. And then this is the current condition today. And one of the interesting things that we noted in looking at the Canadian examples and the US examples is that in the US it's very hard to find master plans of contemporary renovations of public housing. You can find the individual developments and their sales offices, but you'll never find a publicly published, this is the new Robert Taylor Homes. Whereas in Canada it's usually promoted that way. Like the Toronto Community Housing is changing the city for the better, and you get the full image of the new development. So it seems like in the US, there's such a repudiation of public housing that you just don't want to mention it at all. That's the main difference there. And then here's just an example of 2 in a little bit more detail. Canadian example, so Regent Park, Canada's oldest and largest public housing neighborhood, and then the left Jeffrey's Homes in Detroit. And I just put these up to show the different numbers of units. So in Jeffrey's Homes, before there was public housing, there were about 415 market units on the site. Public housing produced about 3 times that many units, 1428 public units. And then in the post-public housing state, you have a reduction to about 40% of the number of RGI units, and you have an additional 135 market units. So you have a great reduction in the number of units, period, and also a huge reduction in the number of subsidized units. And then in Regent Park, you have 1160 market units before. You double the number of units in the public housing neighborhood to 2083. And then they try to maintain, I think they're going to end up with even less than this, but they have 1905 public units and 3,210 market units. So a huge addition of market units to help offset some of the costs of renovating and upgrading a few public housing units. Okay. Oh, no. Actually, I'm going to have a conclusion here. Okay.
If you hit the upper left, there's a little play button. There you go.
Okay, good. Sorry. Okay. The revalorization of these obsolete public infrastructures is intended to act in 2 primary ways. First of all, we have to understand their revalorization as a reassertion of the value of common spaces. If we're in a situation where the spatial commons is disappearing, then we need to develop new weapons to reopen it. Public water closet and tricycle market are 2 interventions in urban space that reassert the crucial role that common resources played in the Fordist period. Fordism responded to the dialectic of labor and capital through the production of leveling infrastructural space. Energy, communications, and mobility infrastructures were provided universally. Under Fordism, this attention to equality was a way of fighting the specter of communism. Under neoliberalism, precarity and militarization of urban space fight labor in an offensive manner. Public water closet and tricycle market are conceived of as nomadic spatial infrastructures that intervene in public space to reassert the importance of the common spaces of the city, to reassert the right that all people have to inhabit recently gentrified urban space. Secondly, by reappropriating these obsolete objects, we're intervening in the single thought of neoliberal time. Our contemporary economic ideology is structured by a temporal paradox, caught between its claims of permanence and its absolute contingency. Neoliberalism was born under Margaret Thatcher's cry that there is no alternative, and it was consolidated in the early 90s with Francis Fukuyama's claim that we have reached the end of history. In design school, we're still limited by this structure, where we're constantly being called upon to work within the reality of neoliberalism. At the same time, neoliberalism has been a project to make time highly uncertain. What we are never sure of is whether we'll have a job tomorrow, or whether we'll be able to repay our debts. Neoliberalism has produced an incredibly precarious working class, embroiled in part-time work, contract work, piecework, and migrant labor. This is the temporality of just-in-time production. Fire workers when production is down, and rehired when it's booming. And architectural work is just as embroiled in this new temporality as it is in the realism of the end of history. Designers are constantly pursuing self-organizing and contingent systems, mimicking the precarity of contemporary systems of production. The revalorization of absolute infrastructures is a way of throwing this time out of joint, of returning to a past as a way of understanding that there are other options in the future. As Deleuze and Bergson argue, the future is produced in the realm of the virtual, the space of memory. It is by first asserting that the permanent precarity of the present is a contingent historical reality itself that we can understand time as duration, as a nonlinear assemblage of different times. These projects attack contemporary time in order to pry open a different future.
He responded, and I said I didn't know what that was. And he said, well, a moderator is someone who kind of like asks questions and tries to keep some kind of dialogue going, and a respondent makes commentary. So I guess he was asking me to make more of a commentary than to kind of ask questions, but I'm trying to do a little bit of both. And I guess what I'd like to do is to try to like sift through. What I'd like to do is to do what I do. So I want to sift through presentations made by Jordan and Adrian and try to find objects, which is what I do kind of daily. And I think the commonalities are kind of like clear at first, but then not so clear. So I'll just, if you just give me a second, kind of like try to rehash some of these things. The first object seems to be a toilet, okay, because both of them very clearly started the discussion with a toilet. But I think the more we look at it, not really a toilet, the object is a mirror. Because as Jordan pointed out, the processes of kind of reflection, self-reflection, and kind of awareness of the body in space and time and in daily activities and rituals was clearly what I saw you bringing to the fore in the first set. And Adrian kind of made that really apparent when he put a mirror in the toilet and didn't really talk about the mirror so much, but talked more about what the mirror enabled. So I guess the first ignored or obsolete or hidden thing is a mirror. Okay, so that's the first object. I'm going for 3 because that's what Kurt was kind of asking for. So neither, by the way, I didn't think that this is what I was going to do, but I just figured I would try this about halfway through. So the second object is a lot harder because it's not really an object per se. So Jordan was examining the toll booths and also the Great Lakes Passage. So I started to think about that object more as a movement or a circulation or a transfer. And that was kind of confirmed by Adrian because he's dealing with the tricycle. And I thought that then the second object would be not an object per se, but a mode of passage. But that doesn't really play by the rules of the game because it has to be an object. So I propose that the second ignored object is something between a door and a wheel. So I'm calling the second object a door on wheels. So now we have a mirror and we have a door on wheels. Now the third object that I'm looking for is much more hidden. And I don't even know, I guess where the conversation I'd like it to go is to try to find what the heck the third object is, because I'm still trying to figure it out. But I think what's clear in both the presentations is that the third object has more to do with the field, because Jordan was focused on agriculture and on issues related to farming, but also to dealing with landscape issues. Adrian was also dealing with a kind of field condition in the form of aggregated units in public housing complexes. So I started thinking about the relationship between crops and units. And then it occurred to me that if we're dealing with crops and units, then maybe the third object is some kind of cross between a plow and a bulldozer. So it's something that kind of tills, but it's also something that wrecks at the same time. So I guess the three objects that I'm putting on the table for a discussion with respect to waste are a mirror, a door on wheels, and something that's between a plow and a bulldozer. So I'm kind of like interested in thinking about these objects, since Kurt wanted to talk about objects, and in particular, I'm kind of interested to think about what is the capacity to deal with or process waste or excess with respect to the objects that Adrian and Jordan have not really put on the table, but I've kind of like culled out of the discussion. So I guess another comment I have, which seems a little bit divergent, but I'll try to bring it back, is that I have a friend who every week, not every week, but very frequently, he likes to poke me by sending me links to various articles about things like hoarding or other. He's really kind of testing me by sending me strange news stories, which he thinks resonate with the kinds of things that I do. And last week he sent me a link to a story on hoarding. Maybe you saw it. It was about a trust fund recipient. You saw that. A trust fund recipient living in New York City, who has been collecting things in his house. And by the way, I think that hoarding is actually a very serious kind of thing, and so I'm not intending to kind of belittle this in any way, but I think there's a point that I want to get to. So the issue with this particular order is that at a certain point he moved out of collecting things in his house, and he started collecting them and storing them underneath his van, which is parked in his van and underneath his van, which is parked outside. So he's trying to keep the space of the objects within his kind of vanscape. So I guess I was interested in the fact that this hoarding made its way into the public realm somehow, but still under protection of the automobile. And two, I was interested in the way that as any therapist or psychologist will tell you, hoarding is not really the act of collecting per se. Hoarding has nothing to do with the inability to stop collecting things. It has to do with the inability to process, to deal with the things that one collects. So the disease or the kind of mental disability is in the processing. So I guess our capacity to kind of hoard is kind of clear, I think, collectively, because we don't have the mechanism by which we can process. And I think some of what you guys have done is kind of introduce mechanisms for processing things. And I guess I can kind of like maybe open up a more open discussion about how we process our mental or how we kind of move our mental disease and kind of come to terms with it through acts of kind of processing or dealing with our egregious capacity to kind of keep collecting things. Or not just, I'm not talking about just collecting, but I'm talking about producing waste, of course. So, so I guess I have a question then for, I should make a question, right? This should make a question. So I'll try to make a question out of this, which is, so, Adrian and Jordan, I'm curious if you could maybe talk about, more specifically about objects and think about, because even though you were talking about you guys were both talking about the processing part of the, you both really dealt with how you were engaging the act of transforming obsolete things, hidden things, or wasted processes into more kind of productive avenues. So I'm curious if you can kind of, since I've kind of like tried to sift through your presentation to uncover objects, if you might kind of talk about what you've been doing with respect to objects.
I'll start by saying I so appreciated, congratulatory, but I really appreciated what you had to share. I think that there's a lot of dialogue, I think, between the things that we're interested in talking about. And I was struck, Dennis, that I might be unable to get out of my own frame of reference, but I was struck that we were never one of those objects that you came to in your list. I mean, I think that there's a kind of inanimate, like object is inherently inanimate in your list. And I didn't quite think it consciously, but I think in trying to frame the way I wanted to talk about things today, I was assuming that we're always, we start as a subject and we always are becoming an object in these cases, and so that's one. And that, so I felt that also, maybe I'm projecting, but I felt that also in the things that you're doing, that they're moving us from being one to the other, and or they're opening up some bleed between the two, across the border between. And I felt also, again, projection probably, that there's some making visible of really large-scale processes in housing and in the informal economies that you bring to the biennial that are made manifest in very small objects. And I think that that's maybe something of a mode of working that we have to talk about. And in the case of that project in China in particular, I was reminded of a way of dealing with the large host institution that I've always found really inspiring, if a little adolescent, in Hans Hacke. That Hans Hacke has many times kind of bitten the hand that feeds, and so because of that habit, it raises an intrinsic challenge to anyone who will engage him that he might bite. And so there's a kind of credit we need to give to host institutions when they work, when they take on that relationship. there's already an openness. That's where I start.
Well, I think you're ignoring the object again. 'Cause I think that these objects are actually animate, like the mirror. I think the mirror is an animate thing. I think I said it was a door on wheels, so it's a door that's moving. And the other thing is a plow or a bulldozer. So these are three things. So I'm just
You're absolutely right.
I'm interested in how these objects kind of like don't come to the fore. Like,
You're right. And I'm sorry, I did not mean at all to ignore them. I actually love these objects. I think that they're really interesting. I think that they're really spot on also. I haven't seen a lot of things, even starting with the mirror. Can I just take a minute to process that?
Yeah, maybe I could dive in and see. I mean, in my own, the things that I showed, I think it's true. I didn't talk that much about them as objects. And that's because really I added a conclusion and an introduction onto three texts that I'd written at different times. And so they weren't really exactly about objects, but I did think that the choices were very object-like. So, I mean, in the first one, I think the portalet is certain. I guess I want to talk about them a little bit more in my relationship to the object. So the portalet was, I think, phenomenologically a really interesting thing, because when you're in a toilet and you have this kind of complete exposure to the world, it's quite a interesting and I think exhilarating kind of mental experience in a sense. So that was, I think, very much a part of it. It was also something like, I was like the janitor for this object. So I was the artist, and it was there was somebody who would like empty the portalet every week, the company that put it there. And I would go and make sure it was like, clean shape every day, tidy up in the portalet. So I had a very close relationship with the object in that way too. And it's interesting too as an object because it is, as you said, there's a mirror involved. And the mirror is very fragile. And so, I mean, portalets are also somewhat fragile. Usually they are in public spaces because people like to push them over. So it had to be screwed down to the ground. And I installed it in two cities, in Toronto and in Ottawa. And in Ottawa, people eventually broke the window. But in Toronto they didn't, which I was surprised by. So this is kind of fragile. I mean, it's a laminated glass, so it's fairly thick, but it's only like something like a quarter of an inch thick or something. So it's a very fragile thing, but it sits there in public. And so there are a couple of things about it that are unlikely in its temporariness, that it would be in public for a long duration. Of course, portalets are used all the time for events, but they're not usually sitting on the street. So there's something about I think there's an interesting kind of thought of as a gift that goes out there, but it's a gift that sort of is a little bit unlikely to sit there for too long, a little bit vulnerable. But I think for some reason people did destroy it.
How long was it there for?
It was only there for a month. It was like for a good while.
Did you ever poll people as to whether, because it was one-way glass, right? Which, for me as residents, is maybe just some law and order type shows of interrogation rooms, but whether they felt insecure about using the bathroom, which they could see out of, and yet even though they knew you couldn't see in, it's still because they could see out. It would seem like you'd be on display.
I didn't do any rigorous interviews, but I talked with lots of people about it.
They used to do those bathrooms in Paris, they would still work this way, that would open after you finished using them, right? And then sometimes they malfunction and they would open when you weren't quite done getting adjusted or whatever. Do you know what I'm talking about? Those bathrooms that have the automatic door. So like this level of, or of course, those dopey changing rooms of product that are smoky when you're in them. So it's like this, this kind of the question of exposure, or I just wondered if that, because I would know that would be something that would be a kind of an interesting tentativeness that would actually add to the tentativeness of your already insecure position.
Yeah. No, I think that's really true. I mean, it increases your precariousness in one sense, but also, yeah, I mean, it's not clear. You can come up to the glass and you can look in. One thing that's nice is you can see people smoking at night. You can see just the butt, just the red part of the cigarette around smoking inside. But you can't see them. So definitely.
Let's stand here. And work on.
There you go, try it.
Didn't they watch National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation?
It's
So,
just so stinky to work on.
That's probably a good reason to do it, actually.
so it was the mirror, it was a door on wheels. What was the third one?
I was kind of, I thought it had, well, I kind of thought about it in these kind of tiers where broadly it was actually the opposite of an object in the field.
Right.
And I thought that that objects within the field had to do with crops and units, and then the associations between a plow and a bulldozer kind of came to mind also. But I was kind of much less clear about what that, it seemed to me to be like more reciprocal processes that were involved rather than kind of identifiable thing per se. And I think that the third one was really interesting for me because it called into question like objects and the inability for me to locate an object within there, or the kind of more hazy, the haziness of the relationship between the I think you were both dealing with like very parallel processes actually, but I still couldn't find like the thing that was like here. So.
Well,
I'll throw a thought out there, which for me, the door on wheels, it's provocative for me because both that and aspects to your tricycle, Adrian, remind me of, I have an acquaintance in San Francisco, Amy Franceschini, who did this project called Victory Gardens. And part of it's a massive project, it's many, many things. Part of it were these kind of, I think it's not the strongest part of the project, but it's these kind of combo objects. There's like a bike barrow and a pogo stick hoe or something, or a shovel, pogo stick shovel. You sort of jump on the pogo stick and it's aerated soil or something like that. But it's, or you get stuck. Anyhow, I haven't tried it, but there's a Dadaist nature to it. It's for a teacup. It's the iron with nails sticking out of it that is. In terms of the second part of Kurt's call, is not just about objects but rituals, and so it calls into question a lot of agency to say like, what do I do with this damn thing? That's what I think. But in the bike barrow and in the tricycle and in all of these is that they don't have any obvious instructions for use, and as a door with wheels is like that's pretty unstable. So I think that in terms of processes, they engage a user to be a very active participant, and maybe that's where it comes back to my conviction that we're talking about subjects becoming objects, or that we ourselves are subjects. That we ourselves are objects in these cases.
So, well, this is something that came up for me in the toilet project, and a number of the projects we talked about were just as designers, artists, whatever we want to call ourselves. I mean, there's some degree of intentionality to the kind of interventions that we're making. But I'm always interested in how we project or understand or take account of the kind of unintended consequences of either those systems, like you were talking about, or even an object like this toilet. I mean, I remember seeing this Liz Diller lecture about the High Line and how she was, in a sense, almost self-promoting based on the fact that everyone was using the High Line in all these serendipitous kind of ways, like throwing theater events and people having sex in the same hotel because it overlooked the High Line and blah, 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 right? So she was really like taking
Because
ownership.
people weren't having sex there before.
What did you say?
Because people weren't having sex.
Because people were having sex there before, right? So, but really taking ownership over that in a way, kind of making it. So I'm just interested in how either as part of a kind of say when you kind of begin a process of designing an intervention or even a kind of research for an intervention like this, how do you take account of the kind of unintended consequences? Because even in some of these systems, I can imagine someone taking these tools and using them in a very, very different kind of way. So, I'm curious how that becomes kind of productive to your own development of object as a kind of system or as a very tangible thing. I mean, I found it really interesting you say you became a janitor, right? I love that. Yeah. So.
I'm trying to think of a clever way to take Dennis's concepts and like bring them back to some of the ideas. I mean, one of the things I'm interested in with our two talks is that we're both interested in contemporary very much, like kind of contemporary political and technological situation in a sense. But my projects look backwards in a sense, and they try to reappropriate these obsolete, but in this context, these elements that have been discarded in some sense of the past and revalorize them in the present in relation to the present in a sense. And I think I think of you as being much more in the present. I mean, both of us are interested in the future in some way, opening up a kind of future, but you're interested in doing it with very much the technologies of the present in a sense. And I think what I like about the way you engage them is there's a certain kind of there isn't exactly a techno-fetishism in them. Like, I like the way you see them as very much in the present, as existing things, in a sense, that can be also repurposed in a way. So rather than being about the invention of the kind of future technologies, it's really about how do we reappropriate the present and produce the future out of it, in a sense. But I'm wondering about how these different figures that Dennis has brought up relate to this kind of shifting between a kind of Fordist past and a kind of post-Fordist present. And thinking about like the mirror and the two-way mirror, like the mirror as a kind of object of individualization, producer of the subject, kind of like mirror phase sort of idea. And then this two-way mirror as a certain kind of figure of surveillance and a kind of promiscuity of like vision and that we live under in a sense of privacy. It's like the two-way mirror is, you can look up close and you can look through it. Like there's no longer any kind of definitive reflection. There's just like this kind of promiscuity of views. Or that this surrealist object is also something like a kind of Latourian hybrid or something. These kind of products of modernity that now approach engage in some way.
I think it's engagement. It's this opt-in part that's really particular. Like the Porto Let is an opt-in architecture, and it has that transform. I think that for me, this is what is very different from the interrogation, is that there's no options there. You're under investigation. It's a truly subjectifying experience. Ability to be walked behind, walked to either side.
For whatever reason, it's called the two-way mirror. Can't explain it.
But you can only see out of it really one way. Unless you
It's really about light vision. It's mostly about
I'd like to come back to what Kurt asked about the unintended consequences.
Yeah.
It's like, it seems to me that we're talking about all this making, and that, one of the laws of entropy is that if you create order in one place, you're creating disorder everywhere else. And so the whole question of all of this stuff is like, what happens to all of the debris that gets torn down, or when we actually build these satellites, how many rare minerals are we taking from across the earth? And it's like, so there's a whole unmaking part of the creation of waste seems to me to be one that needs to be problematized in architecture, because we're always creating disorder everywhere across the world in order to make precious things here, put out there. The consequences are really, severe in other places. And so I'm just curious about how you think about that in respect to some of the concepts.
Say briefly for myself, I feel like that's a kind of very open under subtext for most of this is that we are. I feel like that's something to be discovered again and again and again. Is that there are byproducts of every product, and technology that these projects are all existing within them, and trying to discover them and maybe give a little agency to our living within that. So if my trash is being harvested so that I can be target marketed something, that's something to discover. That byproduct is not to be overlooked, because then we lose all of our agency. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, I was actually way back to Dennis and talking about objects.
Yeah.
Rather than talking about film, because certainly it's like the fact that I'm here taking up this space means that something else is not happening. But the sort of the unintentionality or the not foreseen consequences of everything that we make seems to me. So I think you both of you are doing some really interesting analyses that talk about the political and economic and cultural aspects of a certain kind of making and the ways that that sends out. But I was coming literally to the objects, which is to say the unmaking that happens in the process of making, and how, and the fact that we never deal with that. It's like, but when I'm saying about, this whole notion that about hoarding, and as your point was really interesting to me, is that it's not the accumulation of things, but is that you can't order them. So I remember, for example, telling my kids how to clean their room. I said, you have to have a place for everything. You can't clean your room if you don't have a place to put everything, And one could look at the whole, consumerist culture as to be this huge cultural attempt to try to figure out where to place all of the waste that we're actually accumulating. I work with toxic waste a lot, so we keep trying to figure out where we put this toxic waste instead of stop making it, which would make an obvious solution to do. So it's like, to me, that's the level I was thinking about, and wondered if you are addressing that at all, or whether there's any kind of a discourse that maybe I'm not familiar with that actually is talking about that, about the unmaking of the world embedded in the very existence of the professional world. The discourse.
Do you want to take that?
I don't think I have a very specific response, but a general one maybe, in relation to this question of field, which I also think is a really brilliant thing to put on the table here, because I think that in the context of the public housing that I was talking about, what I didn't illustrate in these three phases, of course, is the fields that emerge in between each phase. So one of the really strange things about these sites in these cities that Jane and I were looking at is that they've been erased twice in like 60 years, which is totally unique. Most cities aren't really out of that quickly. So I think I don't have an answer to where that material goes. I mean, obviously part of my point, like an interesting project that's happening in Toronto right now, which tangentially relates, is this project called Tower Renewal. It's like an attempt to revitalize the towers in the city of Toronto that were built between the 1950s and 1970s, and not to tear them down, so not to create that cycle and that kind of tabula rasa, but thinking of ways to re-insulate them and repurpose them in the present. But I think that
Which is good, because what's going to happen when they all reach the end of the life and we all these houses?
I really appreciate your question, Linda. And I guess my response, given the kind of dialogue that I've tried to set up, is that we need more of these three objects. I think we need more mirrors. I think we need more doors on wheels, and I think we need more plow bulldozers, because those are when I talk about them as objects, obviously I'm not talking about them as objects. I'm talking about them as objects. So when I talk about them, I'm talking about them as things that are aware of the simultaneity of the process of doing one thing at the same time that is doing the opposite thing. So, I think, I don't know what those are, those objects that come out of that, Linda, but I think that's what they have to do. That's how they have to behave. They're objects that actually have certain kind of self-knowledge, right, built into them that allows them to act in the same way that a mirror undoes itself when it makes itself, that kind of way. Yeah.
About in sort of mapping your trilogy of thinking about it and making it kind of clue to this is, it looks like with both projects that it sort of starts with this exposure, right, and making it visible, whether it's the toilet that has resurfaced toilet, everyone's watching me. Whereas a man, you know, probably would be as inhibited. And also thinking about like when I was in India, you know, men are urinating all over the place, and I'm like, I'm gonna go for a walk. But you can't go for a walk because you know when I'm walking, men are like, but I'm urinating in front of you, but it was okay. Anyways, so that whole thing of making visible and exposing and this reclaiming in both, you know, thinking of precision architecture, and I'm just focused on the toilet or the tricycle, and then in how that sort of shifts access, right, in the sense of agency, which both are doing, and then how that affects behaviors, because that's ultimately in these, even looking at these unintended consequences, that it's sort of addressing behavior, whether it's intended for what the artist felt that the piece was going to do, or sort of the byproduct of these behavior. So I guess in line on those three things sort of map onto the objects.
Do you repeat the three things?
I just said exposure, access, and behavior.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting because I feel like they map. I'm not sure how neatly, but they map onto your three objects. And again, it comes back, I think, to Kurt's call that we're talking about objects in relation to rituals, and that as we get these kind of odd hybrid objects, we have a lot to figure out about rituals and what kind of rituals we might have, and agency we might have. The gender point, I think, is really well taken, and I don't really have a strong answer, but I would say one case I failed to get an image for you today. I tried to, but this thing called the femme pissoir that Yolanda Daniels of Studio Sumo designed. It's a really interesting case. That was as it sounds. It was the design of a pissoir that addressed a lot of the kind of issue, the kind of experiences that were built into the pissoir at its inception, and tried to rethink it from the very beginning, from a woman's perspective and a woman's experience, anatomically, visually, like you name it. And it doesn't purport to be a solution, but it's a very provocative, what were the three words, exposure?
Exposure, access, and behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, it really addresses the three. And then, Linda, to come back to the kind of discussion between Dennis's and Linda's points, I think that, well, for one, I'm trying to emphatically say that physical objects, whether they're architectural or the things that architecture processes, like excrement, literally, or trash, that these things are equally harvestable and harvested of information. That information is an object now, and that it has an ecological and a social and a financial role, just like any other thing that we're looking at, and that we fail ourselves to separate these.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for that. I thought that was very interesting the way you tie the things together. But I think maybe the basis of what I'm asking is what you've been talking about has made it really clear, and that is that I think that Homo sapiens are intensely interesting, but we're only a very small part of the globe. And I think what I was trying to figure out in the work that you were suggesting was that it is like, what is it that we as a species are engaged in that have consequences outside of ourselves? And so that, so when I'm asking about the unmaking, of course you can unmake cultures, you can unmake spatial practices, you can unmake, all kinds of different things, but actually unmaking the earth itself seems to me to be something that we're not asking enough questions, given the scale at which we're unmaking the earth right now. It's like that seems to me that question should be embedded in almost everything that we ask, because so much of what we're unmaking and using to make things ends up as trash or waste and does not get put back in any kind of substantial way. So I think it's been helpful to listen to you. I think that actually is the core of the question asking about the unmaking.
Well, I don't know, maybe I think I'm going to throw out an assertion that I'm going to guess you will both disagree with. But I think maybe it'll be an interesting way that you disagree on. I think it ties in a bit with what you're saying. It seems like your work in some ways has similar concerns, but you have kind of fundamentally, this is what you presented just now, fundamentally different orientations towards the idea of waste, or how to intervene with it. And I guess a fourth object maybe to introduce, it seems like, is the shelf, like the kind of German toilet shelf that you brought up. Like, it seems like your work is very much in that, is like a shelf. Like, it's like, here's this shit that we produced under capitalism, let's look at it. And so that sort of seems like a major part of your work is coming out of a certain kind of critique of like, well, these are things that people consider to be waste objects. Let's evaluate what, how did we produce these objects? What is their relationship to like that which we consider not waste? And so in a way, not that your work is devoid of optimism, but there's a certain kind of like, the kind of abject hopelessness of like something that rejects capitalism in general. Like you kind of have like, under the system, nothing good can be produced. Like, and so a lot of the work seems to kind of come from that orientation in terms of looking at something like the anti-market and the non-market, looking at something like public housing. Your work, a lot of it seems to be something about kind of and you can kind of map this onto the environmentalist orientations. Like, you're sort of about like reclaiming things from the waste stream. So like a lot of things that you've shown were sort of like, here's these spaces that are part of borders that can maybe be used in different ways. Or here's all this information material that's generated by the waste stream can be harvested in some way. So it seems like there's a way in which your work is sort of seems to be about sort of how can we like produce less waste and like more metaphors. And yours is more about pointing out how like, our system in general is inherently wasteful and broken. I don't know, does that seem accurate to the way you think about your work? Or?
I would say I think it's fairly good analysis, except that I don't think it's quite as hopeless. I think what I agree with is that, yes, I think that the system is inherently wasteful, and that there is, so to reform it is unlikely to create substantial differences in a sense. But I think that lots of people do interesting projects in capitalism, and I guess I'm interested. I think that a lot of these projects are amazing, and I think I'd like to think that these projects are also optimistic and constructive in a sense. But what I would like to maintain in the object is a kind of critical dimension. So I like to think not so much as negative or resistant objects, but as more dialectical objects or paradoxical objects that are at once somehow optimistic about what's possible to remake in a sense, and to rethink history and to grab onto certain moments that seem positive within it and project them into the future. At the same time, it's just impossibility that the present can be changed without substantive transformations of the way we think about the economy, etc.
I want to, well, thanks for the question, and I really appreciate hearing that. I'm not so sure. I feel like I feel like on the one hand, I want to push pause on answering a question like that, because I feel like in each of these, I'm not so sure to myself how coherent, how cohesively these things all sit together, because I'm in the process of pursuing most of them now. And so they're all, their correlation to each other is like still in formation in my mind. And that also regards what their purpose is. So some of it, I think I'm uncomfortable with either feeling too nihilistic or negative or hopeless about it, or the word techno-fetishism came up earlier, as much as I really dislike, oh, you brought it up, I really dislike that direction with thinking about responsive architecture, things like this. Kind of false promises, or empty promises, or simplistic promises, optimization and salvation. It just shuts down. I'm equally suspicious of its opposite. So I'm not entirely sure, except that for me, this has been used in the last couple of years trying to understand many of these relationships between architecture and often human-computer interaction at a really big scale. So I'm not looking generally at like the home or the store, and I don't eschew it. It's just what I haven't chosen. And I think, and I don't know if this comes back to you also, Adrian, but I feel like your question comes back also to a little bit myself, which is about thinking about what kind of agency or role or activity that I'd like to have, not just as a full-time academic, but thinking of myself, frankly, as an employee with the state. I take it very literally, and I think of myself as having an opportunity or maybe even a job to be in some kind of dialogue with larger organizations, whether it's federal or otherwise. And that's sparked me to try and ask these questions of myself. It sounds really grandiose, so I'm sorry about that. So I don't know.
No, it's grandiose. It's your dictionary.
That's right.
I think we need to wrap up, so I'm going to say this is a comment more than a question that maybe we could talk about. I'm very interested in, the fact that most of the projects that we looked at today, this morning, most likely won't go beyond the domain of speculation. They might go beyond that. There you go. But I think most of the work we do now, most of the work
They change the world.
Right. No, but that's where I'm interested, because I think there is in even kind of speculative practice there is a lot of agency actually, and specifically in how certain ideas say proliferate. So I'm interested, for instance, in this question of the ritual. A ritual is something which is actually repeated and mimicked, and which ultimately proliferates culturally speaking. So when I think about something like the tricycle, right, as a kind of system, I'm wondering if there is a possibility or an interest, and I'm kind of curious to talk about it when we have our breakdown, in terms of how that kind of system, that it can be proposed as a kind of system. And I wonder if that also poses you, Adrian, as something, much like you said, you become janitorial, where you also become kind of entrepreneurial, in a sense, in terms of your the kind of alliances that you draw, say, with street vendor networks in China, where you actually are, in some ways, supporting them, but also in a kind of, maybe entrepreneurial is not the right word, but where it's not necessarily the clean role of the kind of do-gooder. Do you know what I mean? But where you're actually kind of proposing techniques which can be appropriated, circulated, and proliferated beyond, say, the kind of particular instance of that site, that they have a kind of iterability. But also, again, this kind of ambiguity where we don't know where it could go. I mean, how a certain technique can be appropriated. I mean, I couldn't help but think that some of the projects you were working on, they have that potential as well. I mean, you're setting up a set of very provocative ideas that one could see maybe translated in different ways by other people. And I find that to be their potential, right?
Yeah.
If they don't, right, yeah. So it's just something I wanted to kind of throw out there, but we actually really should stop and take a short break. We're going to shorten the break because we started a bit late. So we'll take about 5 to 10 minutes and then come back together. So thank you so much.